Welcome to Adventures in Education, a program that spotlights positive things happening in the world of education in Southern Oregon and Northern California. I'm your host, John Letz, and we are now starting part 2 of a program, a conversation with State Representative Pam Marshal. Pam, welcome to
Thank you.
Adventures in Education the second time around.
You bet, absolutely.
We talked a lot in the first programs. If you want to know about revenue and funding in the state of Oregon, I recommend watching part 1 of this program. And where we kind of came to, which we could repeat a few things, is with Measure 101.
Right.
Our viewers will, if they live in Southern Oregon, will get to vote on that, or in Oregon.
In Oregon, that's right. That's right. Measure 101 will be on the ballot in January. The exact election date is January 23rd, although, of course, with our vote by mail system, you can turn in your ballots for a couple weeks before that. And this is an extremely important vote from my point of view. To back up just a little bit, under the Obama administration, the state of Oregon had the opportunity to expand our Medicaid system. We call it Oregon Health Plan here in Oregon. And as a result, we have about 1 million Oregonians that are covered by that system now, up to 138% of the poverty level. Of that million, 40% are children, so 400,000 children across the state covered by the Medicaid system. When we came to the legislative session in 2017, we were significantly short in our ability to continue that coverage. We were looking for about $600 million. And we sat down and agreed with the hospitals and the insurance companies on an assessment system that would have the insurance companies and hospitals contributing monies toward the Medicaid system. Those dollars are then matched at the federal level. Some of those dollars flow back directly to the hospitals and others go directly to the Medicaid system. As a result of all that budget maneuvering, we were able to put together in the legislature a proposal that would keep the system whole, that would allow us to continue coverage for those 1 million Oregonians without any kind of disruption. It was an extremely proud day for me when I got to vote on that package. Unfortunately, a couple of our colleagues decided to challenge that decision, and they embarked upon a campaign to get an adequate number of signatures to force the issues to the ballot. And as a result, in January, voters across the state will be asked to vote on the legislature's decision. So a yes vote confirms the legislature's decision and will keep all the tax assessments in place, continue coverage without any kind of disruption. A no vote sends us back to the drawing board, and frankly, I don't know what happens then.
You know, one of the significant things I heard in your explanation, the people in the industry are already on board. Did I get that right? They're already on board.
The hospital stepped up. They had some concerns about it, but what they realized is what we all know is that we are all in this healthcare boat together. We have to figure out how to pay for healthcare costs across the board, and we are better off in doing that if a larger number of people have some sort of health care coverage to bring into the doctor's office or bring into the hospital setting when they need care. The alternative is for people to be essentially left out of the boat, to have them defer care until maybe their illness is more serious, to have them receive care at the emergency room, which is the most expensive place that you can enter the healthcare system. So it's basically a cost-effective system for us to try to expand coverage and keep people on board. The insurance companies also saw the benefit of that. There was among the insurance companies, there was one that had retained concerns about it. The others all bought in. Again, why would they voluntarily take on a tax assessment? It really harkens back to the earlier explanation. They understand as well that the costs of the system will bounce back onto insurance companies and to covered people, and in the cost of increased premiums if we don't provide care in the most cost-effective way that we can. And that means we have to have coverage that allows people to get the care they need at a very early point.
Well, it sounds like an easy decision to make, but I'm sure there'll be some interest that will work to stop that, because it seems like whenever we have something that might work, we have people against it. But you know, it really sounds like one of these things of pay a little up front or pay through the nose. later
Well,
on. You pay sooner or later.
We are very lucky in the state. We are now up to around 95% of us with some sort of health care coverage. Now, we know it's not perfect in all cases. Some of that coverage is very expensive. There are big deductibles that make it still difficult to access care. But that's a tremendous step forward from where we were a few years ago.
Something we can be proud of as Oregonians.
And the other really important piece of this is that we have been able to put together a healthcare system that really emphasizes prevention and the upstream impacts on your health, so that our Medicaid system, that system that covers 1 million folks, are providing pretty cost-effective and compassionate care. So we're making some, I would say, very exciting reforms in the way we're actually delivering the care that we're now covering.
Well, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
It's good that we have, like I said, something we can be real proud of as Oregonians, and we'll be even prouder when we pass 101.
Vote yes, please.
Well, I'll tell you, this is a show about education, and my viewers may be thinking, why are you talking about health insurance? Well, I can tell you as a teacher, when you see kids that are suffering, sometimes it's part of that. If they could get, and their families could get the coverage, the care is really what it is, the care when they need it, then it doesn't develop into bigger things.
Right.
A kid whose throat is on fire with a strep infection or something is not going to pay attention to your lesson on how to find the least common denominator or anything else. They're just trying to survive the day. So their education, if they can't get the care they need, their education will suffer. There's no question about it.
Well, and I completely agree with you. And we should note that there are public health impacts here too. It is far smarter of us to make sure that a child has coverage than to have that kid show up at kindergarten with chicken pox. So providing care is the compassionate thing to do. I think it's also the very smart thing to do.
Yeah, I'm very glad that you're behind that, and I hope people will. It's so hard for people to find the truth about things because we know. I would say from '97 there were a lot of things said in a lot of commercials, and commercials for political reasons are not. There's no filter to go through. Basically, if you can pay the money, you can say whatever you want.
Right.
And there was a lot of misinformation that was out there that helped people make up their minds, and in that case, not so much for the better. So what would you recommend if someone wants to learn more about Measure 101? What would be a good source of information they could go to?
Well, we will see more information unroll over the next month. We're kind of at the beginning of that campaign cycle, but there is a website, Measure 101, that has some excellent information on it. I would invite people to email me if you want to talk more about it, if I can answer questions. Can I say my email?
Absolutely, please do.
It's rep.pammarsh@oregonlegislature.gov.
Okay.
And if I can't answer your questions, I'll put you in contact with other experts who can delve into them.
Okay, great. Well, let's talk about a measure that did pass already a little over a year ago, and it directly affects education, and that was Measure 99. Kind of came with its own funding, didn't it?
Well, Measure 99 provides, when fully funded, would provide outdoor school for all eighth graders that go to outdoor school. Fifth graders that go to outdoor school. We haven't quite attained full funding for it yet. This was a year in which we really struggled with the budget.
Now this was to be from lottery funds, right? A percentage of the.
But there's still a lot of demands on those lottery funds, so it didn't grow the lottery fund bucket. It just
the pie is not any bigger.
The pie is not any bigger. But we were able to put $24 million toward outdoor school. I think at full funding it would be closer to 40. So we have a ways to go, but we'll get a bunch of those fifth graders out into the outdoors, or wherever their classroom chooses to take them.
Now, what I understand, the extension services are the ones that right now are tasked with, we'll call it vetting or
managing
the the schools, the facilities that it would take, to do this?
It's going to be an issue, actually, just building up enough facilities. And it's interesting, I was at a meeting of the superintendents in the Butte Falls. Folks were talking about how they live in the woods, so they don't need to take kids to the woods, so they're taking their kids to the beach.
Sure.
It's, wherever we can get children out to an environment that's not one that they're familiar with, and let them see something else and let them commune with nature. I think it's a terrific opportunity.
Now, I know in this area we have the Klamath Outdoor Science School, and they're want to be one of those places that host this. Siskiyou Field Institute is another one in Josephine County. So we do have some local places that are hoping to be part of this this whole thing of the outdoor school.
Yeah, I think as long as we can get the funding together, we can grow the facilities to be able to provide that for children.
There's lots of research actually that shows that when you take kids outside, when kids get to spend time outside, there's perhaps not fully understood, but there's a benefit, a cognitive benefit, that when you connect yourself with nature in that way of doing things outside, particularly things that are nature-centered, that it actually helps the brain learn things that may have nothing to do with being outside.
Well, it seems particularly important in a day and age where we are really attached to our devices, all of us who are adults as well as our children. So if you can leave the cell phones and the laptops and the whatever else it is that you're attached to behind and actually have that different kind of experience, how can it not benefit you in some fundamental ways?
Yeah, and it does. Now I'm going to shift a little bit from the funding and the measures. Oregon is the word refuge is coming to my mind, but that's not really, it's a
sanctuary.
Sanctuary, thank you, sanctuary state. Not everyone supports that, and of course we're kind of in a battle with the federal government about that now. How important do you think it is that we remain a sanctuary state?
Well, we passed some legislation during the session that is really about privacy in terms of this debate over citizenship status. And what we did was to say clearly to give clear direction to school districts and local governments across the state that they should not be sharing any information about a child or a family that wasn't otherwise requested by law to the federal government. I think this is a standard that applies across the population. I may or may not have a citizenship issue, but if I have a third grader, I don't want the school telling anybody else about who picks up that third grader or when they come or where that family lives, my family lives. So this was an effort to really, in very confused times, give very clear direction to local governments and to school districts that are touching children. And I think it's really I think it was an important piece of legislation.
Well, I'll echo that in my own experience. One of the things I did when I worked in the Medford School District was we had a parent outreach, a family outreach. So parents, after putting in 8 to 10 hours of work a day, would come with their families, and we provided childcare and homework club for their parents. Their parents learned English. That's what they wanted to do. And so we had them on computers with Rosetta Stone. There were weeks when we ran out of computers. The main computer lab at the district office, we ran out of computers. Right. We had to go borrow some from human resources in order to get, for everyone to be able to do it. But when the word was spreading in the community that ICE was showing up outside certain businesses and picking people up, it was very quiet. There were very few people because they were afraid to come out because they don't want their families separated by this. I think what Oregon has done as a sanctuary state at least puts some amount of protection and confidence for these families. as a teacher, I was never, I was instructed, in fact, because we learn about federal law, that we're not to ask about whether someone has papers or not. As a teacher, it was none of my business.
Right.
But I do know, you get to know the families pretty well, and sometimes you just happen to know that either they've gotten their citizenship, which is something they will very readily tell you about because they're justifiably proud of it. But what I would see is that even families who had no issues with legal status were still afraid of these things. Now, some people hear that and they go, they're overreacting. That's what you hear. Well, people who paid attention in history class, which a lot of people apparently didn't, who paid attention in history class, know that during the Great Depression, the United States government put a whole bunch of Hispanic people on trains, whether they had papers or not, and sent them into Mexico. And that's the kind of history that families learn around their table. Let me tell you about great-grandfather Alberto and what happened to him. So these kinds of measures, it seems to me as a teacher, at least with that, with the types of laws that we have, are so important to these families that are trying so hard to succeed here and be good citizens of the United States. And speaking of that, we have the whole situation with DACA. And does this relate in some way with what the state's doing?
Well, I think the state is playing defense on efforts that are happening at the federal level. We're trying to step up to our immigrant population and defend them whenever we can. The stuff that's come down from the federal level has had a tremendous impact already on many of our communities. The community of Woodburn has really been undermined because families won't come out. They won't go to shops. They distrust the schools. So we are trying to provide some measure of safety because these are our friends and neighbors. It's imperative that we have schools and institutions where they feel safe. And we have a lot of law enforcement stepping up and saying, yes, that's true. We don't want to threaten people in a way that they won't participate in law enforcement, that they won't step up and report a crime, that they're afraid to be a witness. Now, obviously, if there's a subpoena, there's any indication of criminal activity, that's a very different situation.
Very different, yeah.
But what we're really talking about is those law-abiding folks, children and adults, who simply don't have their citizenship. And we need to take I believe that we need to take a very compassionate and protective approach to those folks to keep them as part of our communities.
One thing I remember from your newsletter that really struck me is your actions in the legislature seem to be, as they should be, reflective of the community that you represent. And you would think that people in our legislature in Oregon, that's what their intention would be. And yet I know we have legislators in Oregon and in all 50 states who become guests of an organization called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, who have a definite agenda that has nothing to do with, it started with big businesses saying we want to make sure laws happen that support what we want.
Right.
And it's gone down the road where a lot of businesses have pulled out because, quite frankly, they've taken such an extreme right turn. Do you see danger from that from some representatives in our legislature?
I think we've done a pretty good job in Oregon of trying to separate ourselves from some of the pretty virulent and unfortunate conversation that's happening at the federal level. We have a history, a legacy as a state of really working across parties, and House and Senate members working together, and urban and rural folks working together. And if you look back on the state's history, a lot of the things that we're so proud of, the beach bill, recycling, those were efforts that came out of bipartisan approaches. And yet, I think at the same time, when you have so much tumult happening on the federal level, that it's hard for that to not percolate down to us in some ways.
Yeah.
So I think we just really have to stay on the alert to make sure that we continue to draw some lines around ourselves, that we continue to understand that we're a state of 4 million people. We have a history of working together. We are all better off if we can figure out how to continue to do that. But I will say there are definitely have been some tensions, you know, that do reflect what's going on at the federal level.
What are things that Oregonians can do to help foster that kind of bipartisan, what's good for Oregon, which is, you know, in my view, what people are supposed to be going to, to Salem for?
Well, it's interesting, you know, we think, I think because the decisions that that are contentious get the most publicity, we tend to think of the legislature as being a really contentious place. The fact is about 87% of the legislation that we voted on this year passed with significant bipartisan action. So it's a fairly small percentage of legislation that really is something that we argue over. Some of those arguments can be deep and abiding because of a clash of values, different ways of seeing the world, different approaches to spending money. And I think what helps us in the Oregon legislature is we can have, and did have during the session, again, some pretty lively debates on the floor, and yet when we leave there, we're all going to the lunchroom, we're going to see each other, we're going to have a conversation over our spaghetti or whatever it is, and recognize again that if we can continue to relate to each other on a personal level, then we can get past the moments that are tense, and recognize that, you know, we're going to continue to work together. And there may not be moments there will not be all moments when we agree, but we're still allied in our general direction to provide the best we can for Oregonians.
And that sounds like something, again, that Oregonians can be proud of. I
Well,
know
that's our charge.
The district where I live in Josephine County, the representative there had a family tragedy, and the support they got from their fellow legislators had nothing to do with party affiliation. It was, this is one of us, and this tragedy has happened.
And we really do still operate on a very personal level, which I think enables you to get through some of the tougher moments.
So what are we looking at this next session, this short session?
So we'll come to, so Oregon, just to take a step back, has a 2-year cycle. In the first year of the cycle, which was 2017, we're putting together the budget, and we have about a 5-month legislative session that went from February through the beginning of July. In the second year of the cycle, we have just a 6-week session. So we'll start the beginning of February, go to mid-March. And we haven't had these short sessions or this alternative year session for very long. Really is something that's happened in the last 10 or 12 years, because life has gotten more complicated, and we've recognized we really can't go 2 years without coming together to do some decision making. Now, originally the 6 weeks was intended to be kind of the place where you dot your I's and cross your T's and fix things you might have left out. More and more we're seeing bigger, more expansive, more complex issues coming up in the short session. And I think we'll probably see some of those in February.
Do you think eventually there might be 2 equally long sessions?
I would support looking toward that. You know, my experience is brief so far, but we're living in complicated times for big issues that can't be addressed in one long session. To have to wait another 2 years, I think is not realistic of some of the urgency of things that we're facing.
What kind of work do you do between sessions?
Well, I'm figuring that out since I'm just experiencing this for the first time.
Yeah.
So far, I've spent much of my off time driving back and forth to Salem, because it turns out this is really when the preparatory work for the sessions, both the next short session and potentially for the long session after that, takes place. So a lot of work groups, a lot of problem solving, and that really requires being in the same room. So I drive up and down the freeway a lot.
Now, I know that part of what you do comes from your getting input from constituents. What are some of the ways that happens?
Well, that is actually part of the job I like the best. because I like talking about what's going on up there, getting feedback, just having that conversation. So I've done it in a number of ways. I have an email list that people are invited to be on. I send it out probably quarterly, not all the time, but when I think there's something important to share. I did a town hall in each of the communities that's part of my district when the session was over. So I think we did 6 town halls, just as an opportunity to invite people in, tell them what went on, answer questions. I'm going to do a couple more town halls in January as we look toward the short session and to talk about Measure 101 and what we see coming up in the short session. And I try to just be as available as I can when community events are happening or there's an opportunity to meet with folks, because I think it's really important and I enjoy it. It's really important to get that feedback.
That's the whole idea of our
Absolutely.
democratic system, of getting that. Pam Marsh, I want to thank you so much for being with us on Adventures in Education.
Thank you so much for what you're doing here.
And this is part 2 of a program we've had. We're going to wrap it up here. But if you want to see what happened in part 1, just visit the website at rvtv.sou.edu, and from there you can find out when and where Adventures in Education can be seen, and there are other ways to have it on demand as well. That would be archive.org/details/Rogue TV. Thank you, our viewers, and I want to thank my crew. I forgot to thank them in part 1, and we wouldn't have this program if not for all of this work that these wonderful people do. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time on Adventures in Education. I'm John Letz.